triplets, $60,000. Every single one of your constituents, $60,000. You might be able to look them in the eye and say, that's okay. The president decided to look them in the eye and say, you know what, that's not right. It cannot go on forever. We have to have a plan for figuring out how to start paying back the money that we have borrowed from people for all of these years. The next word in the budget was foundation, and I tried to come up with what was the foundation, what we were trying to get to when we picked that word. What was the foundation for American greatness? And the foundation for the American greatness is 3% growth. Every single time I'm in the Oval Office talking to the president, whether it's on budgets, tax policy, trade policy, energy policy, regulatory policy, those discussions are driven by one goal and one goal only. How do we get America back on track in the economy? There are some folks who believe, and many of those folks happen to work at the Congressional Budget Office, that 1.9% growth is the best we can do forever. We refuse to accept in this administration that pessimistic view of the future. We refuse to accept that the new normal is 1.9%, especially when the history of this nation is above 3%. And that goes back to the founding. You go back to World War II if you want to. For some reason, some of us want to accept the fact that we will only ever grow at below 2% growth again. If you are in this room today or watching this and you are 30 years old, you have never had a job as an adult in a truly healthy American economy. And an economy at 3% is so much different than an economy at 2%. It's hard to describe except like this. In the 1990s, when I was a younger man, we had excellent growth in this country. We had it under a Democrat administration and a Republican-controlled Congress. If you got fired back then during a healthy American economy, you could find another job easily. If you did not like your job, you could quit and start your own economy, your own business. That type of optimism dies in a 1.9% economic growth world, and we need it back. And everything we do in this administration, including the principles in this budget, are designed to get us back to 3% growth. We do all that, by the way. I'd still fund the president's priorities. We've talked about them before: national security, border security, law enforcement, veterans, school choice, paid parental leave. I hope we get a chance to talk about that today. Infrastructure, money in here for that. We can talk about that. We do not touch Social Security, retirement, or Medicare. I look forward to having that discussion. We also focus, Chairman Enzi, on unauthorized programs. $310 billion. One of the questions I ask, if you think it's so important, why don't you vote to reauthorize it? I think that's a fair question when you look at this through the perspective of the people who are paying for it. I've enjoyed watching all the politicians on TV this week saying, oh, we wish we spent more money on this program, and the program is unauthorized. And I cannot go back to the taxpayers and say, yeah, I want to spend more money on a program that Congress doesn't care enough about to even vote on anymore. That's no longer defensible. So we do all that, and we balance the budget within 10 years because we look at the government differently. We are no longer going to measure compassion by the number of programs or the number of people on those programs. We are going to measure compassion by the number of people we get off of those programs and back in charge of their own lives. We no longer measure success by how much money we spend, but by the number of people we actually help. And that is the last part of the budget, which is American greatness. So, anyway, with that, Mr. Chairman, I look forward to the hearing today. Look forward to answering your questions. I hope I do a decent job with it, and I appreciate the opportunity to be here to present the President's budget.
Thank you. You're one of the few people that ever finished up a minute ahead of time.
I'm from the House. We only get 5 minutes over there, Mr. Enzi. Y'all's 7 minutes is very, very generous.
Now we do turn to questions, and I'll explain the process. Committee members, each member will have 5 minutes for questions, beginning with myself and then Senator Sanders. Following the two of us, I'll alternate questions between Republicans and the minority. All members who are in attendance when the hearing began will be recognized in the order of seniority. For those who arrived after the hearing began, you're on the list in order of arrival. If your turn's on the list to be recognized and you aren't available, you'll be moved to the bottom of the list. The next senator on that side will be asked questions. So we will start the questions. Director Mulvaney, the President's budget reduces deficits for OMB's pre-policy baseline by $5 6/10 trillion, while $3 6/10 trillion of this deficit reduction is directly scored to policies in the budget. The rest is estimated to come from economic feedback. Specifically, the budget projects more than $2 trillion in increased revenue from increased economic growth. What initiatives in your budget do you expect that will lead to that growth?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. When Secretary Mnuchin, Director Cohn, and I, as members of the so-called Troika, sat down shortly after I was sworn in, we had a chance to look at the CBO numbers that proposed or projected that 1.9% growth. And then we asked ourselves, okay, what are we going to do to get that number to 3%? That $2 trillion worth of additional revenue you mentioned comes from the 3% economic growth throughout the 10-year budget window. And so what we said is, okay, we're going to have tax reform. That should increase GDP. We're going to have regulatory reform, which we actually thought had a larger increase on GDP than tax reform. We're going to have new trade policies. We're going to undo Obamacare and repealing, according to the Congressional Budget Office, repealing Obamacare actually added to the GDP growth in this country, because even the Congressional Budget Office recognized that the passage of Obamacare created a disincentive for people to work. So that's what we did. We went through our policies line by line, and I tell you, depending upon the values that we assigned to them, we actually came up with some numbers that were higher than 3%. The President did mention numbers higher than 3% on the campaign, but we settled on the 3% growth. We thought it was a conservatively defensible number.
Thank you. In one of the supporting volumes of the budget, I found a truly startling figure. According to your documents, in the 10 years ending in 2016, non-independent agencies added about $78 to $115 billion in estimated annual costs through the finalization of new regulations. And this doesn't capture the entire regulatory burden, as regulations such as those stemming from the Dodd-Frank Act are imposed by independent agencies. How does this budget propose to review those rules to lessen their impact on the economy and prevent such buildup of regulations in the future?
We've actually already taken steps in that direction. Chairman Enzi, shortly after I arrived, OMB reviewed and approved an executive order to address the regulatory climate in a couple of different ways. Number one, we instituted a one in, two out rule. That before agencies introduce a new piece of regulation, they have to go back and look at two that get off of the books. By the way, it's been extraordinarily difficult to do that. As we've been through the process, what we've learned is it's not that hard to slow down an agency on creating new regs, okay? But when you ask an agency, a bureaucratic agency that is designed to create regs, to start to deregulate themselves, it is a it's a muscle that they have not used for a long time, if ever. So we've been a little bit surprised by the challenges in looking for those two out. So we think we've done a pretty good job so far of slowing down the new regulations into the pipeline. But we're going to work very hard to make sure we spend as much energy on getting old regs off of the books. We also instituted a net $0 policy, that if you're going to introduce a new reg that creates $100 worth of burden on the American population, you're going to have to find some to get rid of that same $100 so that there's a zero net regulatory burden on the economy.
That's what I've been hearing in Wyoming. Last November, the GAO issued the results of a study that I had requested that found that the cost estimates for the Education's Department various income-dependent student loan repayment plans has been re-estimated upwards by tens of billions of dollars. The reason was that enrollment far exceeded the prior administration's original estimates. This budget includes another huge upward revision of student loan program costs, with the anticipated cost of the outstanding portfolio rising by an additional $39 billion. While the budget says $8 billion of this is due to still greater enrollment, another $18 billion is due to updated collection rate assumptions concerning the roughly $100 billion in defaulted student loans the department currently manages. It seems we keep finding that the student loan programs are more expensive than the government expects. How does the President's budget proposal attempt to contain student loan costs going forward?
I have not reviewed the FSA report, but I think we all know that there was a lot of pressure, I think, during the Affordable Care Act debate to look to the student loans to be generating money. And you can ask yourself whether or not there was pressure to show unreasonably rosy numbers at the time as part of the Obamacare discussion. As we look forward, though, and talk about what the President proposed when he was campaigning, the President made specific promises regarding taking the the variety of repayment programs that are out there today to repay student loans and condense them into one. And that's exactly what we've done in the budget. We take a single income-based program and tie your repayments of your student debt to the amount of money that you are making after you graduate. And that leads to a circumstance where if you're making less money, you'll pay back less of your loan. If you're making more, you'll pay back more. When President Obama, I think, introduced something similar, he suggested that we forgive the debt after 20 years. We actually moved that to 15 years. But by doing it in a single plan that's actually easier for folks to use, and we expect them to use it, and by making the variables depending on income, we actually save a considerable amount of money.
Thank you. My time's expired. Senator Sanders.
Thanks very much, Mr. Chairman. You know, before we go further, I find it a little bit unfair that Mr. Mulvaney and many people in the Trump administration disparage the director of the CBO when it was Tom Price, the former Republican chairman of the Budget Committee, who appointed Dr. Hall in the first place. So let's get that clear. Mr. Mulvaney, as you know, the United States today has more income and wealth inequality than any major country on earth. Top 0.1% now owns almost as much wealth as the bottom 90%. 52% of all new income today is going to the top 1%. But your budget thinks that it is good public policy to provide $52 billion in tax breaks to the wealthiest family in this country, a family already worth $128 billion. You think that a family like the Walton family, where one guy there owns 4 Ferraris and 1 Maserati that are worth more than $65 million, are just in desperate need of massive, massive tax breaks. You think that Sheldon Adelson, who among other things contributed $5 million for the Trump inaugural, is in need of a massive tax break, as well as the Koch brothers. So my question is pretty simple. And I want you to tell the American people why you think it is a good idea to give $3 trillion in tax breaks to the top 1% at a time when the rich are becoming much richer, while at the same time you're going to throw 17 million children in this country off of health insurance because of the unconscionable cuts that you are making to Medicaid, why you're going to throw seniors in the state of Wyoming or the state of Vermont off the Meals on Wheels program, maybe the one nutritious program that they get a day, why you're going to throw women and low-income babies off of the WIC program at a time when infant mortality rates in this country was already high. Do you really think it is a great idea to tell a low-income pregnant woman that you're going to take away the WIC program, take away nutrition programs from children in order to give a massive tax break of $52 billion to the Walton family? Please explain your logic to the American people.
I'll see if I can handle each of those in reverse. Actually, let me deal with the CBO first. I can't disparage who I don't know, and I don't think I've ever disparaged the director of the
You made a
CBO.
dismissive remark about him.
I made it.
Even the CBO. You guys appointed the director.
And again, all I'm telling you is that the results are awful.
But you appointed him, so let's go with that.
I measure performance by results, Mr. Sanders, and if you continuously
Your
put out
opinion
bad
is
numbers,
that the results are terrible. I'm suggesting that it was a member of the Trump administration who appointed this gentleman, not some kind of radical Democrat.
So we can agree then that the CBO puts out bad data.
No, we
Okay.
can't. We can agree that you guys are beating up on a man that you appointed because you don't like his results. But anyhow, get back to the question.
I don't
Why
like-
tax
don't
breaks
like
for
the
billionaires
results, 'cause
and
they're
cuts
not right.
for
WIC is,
working class kids?
WIC serves all the projected participants. There's no change there. Meals on Wheels is not reduced at all. The change that we make is through the
CBDG program, which you
the
eliminate.
block grant thing.
So you eliminate the block grant, you tell me that funds the program, you tell me that doesn't have an
No,
impact
the
on the
program is funded, Senator, through the old age or senior nutrition program, I think through HHS, which we don't change.
No, that's not true.
No, it is true, actually. The CDBG program is a block grant to the states,
Yes.
and some states do choose to use some of
And
that
you
money
eliminate
on
that
Meals on
program.
Wheels, and that
All right,
total.
the bottom line is,
Senator, I mean, if you,
go ahead, answer the question.
the total money for Meals on Wheels that comes from CDBG is 3%. That's it.
Yeah,
And I
but-
don't know how you can possibly contend that we're going
But
to
you are
kill people at
eliminating
3%.
the program that funds not only Meals on Wheels, but many other programs at the discretion of governors and mayors.
I would be more than happy to have a long discussion about CDBGs. You asked about Medicaid as well. The slashing of Medicaid, the dramatic cuts to Medicaid, is a slower growth rate in Medicaid. There's 1 year exception during the Affordable Care Act where, the American Health Care Act, where the bill calls for the end to expansion, and there's a small reduction that year, but generally speaking, over the 10-year budget, Medicaid spending goes up every.
Yeah, but so does healthcare inflation. We go through these games every single year. Inflation is going up a lot faster than the money that you're putting in. Bottom line is, tell me, let me get back to one question.
Sure.
Why do you think the Walton family needs a $52 billion tax break?
My guess is that you're basing that assertion on the only tax detail that we have in the budget.
The
which is
repeal of the
repeal
estate tax. Exactly.
Right. And if we want to have a talk about why we're repealing that, I'd be more than happy to do that.
Good, let's tell me.
Because ordinary people are paying more.
No, ordinary people do not have a wealth of $128 billion.
The average-
That's not an ordinary person.
The average increase across this nation since
You're not
the inception
answering
of
the
Obamacare
question. The
is
question is,
105%.
answer the question. The wealthiest family in America gets a $52 billion tax break as a result of the repeal of the estate tax.
That's correct.
Tell the American people why you think that's good when you cut Medicaid and you cut programs for kids.
Again, we don't cut Medicaid. We're talking about repealing Obamacare. The results
Throwing
that you
23
mentioned,
million people off of health insurance. That's right?
which is a CBO number that I think you just agreed could be wrong at the
No, I
outset
didn't
of this
agree to
meeting.
that at all.
Okay. That we repeal Obamacare.
Why does a billionaire family get a $52 billion tax break?
Because
Please tell the American people.
Because we think it's wrong that real, ordinary folks lose coverage, and we want to get rid of the
Ordinary
plan.
people. Is
Yes.
the Walton family an ordinary family?
No, they're not. They're extraordinary, but ordinary people are losing coverage today under Obamacare.
I asked you
and
why
we
the
repeal it.
wealthiest family in America is getting a $52 billion tax break.
And I'm answering the question by saying because we repeal Obamacare.
No, and the estate tax, which applies to the top 0.2%.
Senator, okay, if that, well, I'm sorry. I thought the assumption was we were looking at the tax reductions that are contained in Obamacare. repeal.
No, that's not what we're
You're mentioning
talking
the
about.
estate
No,
tax.
no, no.
Okay.
We're talking about the repeal of the estate tax, which you
right.
just mentioned.
The budget assumes a deficit-neutral tax plan, because when we wrote the budget, we did not have nearly enough specifics to assume what you're assuming, which is the specific reductions. Yes, the proposals that the White House published about 3 or 4 weeks ago, the principles that we set forward does include a reduction of the estate tax.
Repeal of the estate tax, sir.
He said, yeah, you're absolutely right. It is a repeal of the estate tax, but I think it's mathematically impossible to take those general principles and assume a direct impact on a particular family. You
No,
can't
that's
do it.
not-
Nobody can do it. I've seen estimates from groups that say, oh, it's going to
No,
add the
that's not-
deficit by
that's-
$2 trillion to $10 trillion. People
No,
are just
that's
making
really
up
not
numbers.
true. I mean, we don't know when people are going to be dying, that's for sure. But you can
I'm sorry, you
make
said
those
we
estimates.
don't know that people are going to
No,
be
you
dying.
don't know when somebody is going to be dying. But the truth is that if the family is worth
I'm pretty
100,
sure they're going to die eventually.
that we can be pretty sure of.
Well, at least we agree on something. Thank you.
Senator Graham.
That was borderline fascinating. So, for 8 years, President Obama presented a budget, which was a proposal, and got 0 votes in the United States Senate or the United States House. It's fair to say we're going to continue that trend.
I might
This
get one or
budget.
two, Senator.
You might get one, but it won't be mine. And let me tell you why. I really appreciate you trying to balance the budget in 10 years. You got the Budget Control Act numbers to deal with. That's correct, right? That's the constraint we imposed on you. And if you're going to balance the budget in 10 years, there's really no good ways to do it. Obama increased taxes by $3.1 trillion in 2017. I think that would devastate the economy. That's probably why it got no votes. Some of the cuts you've made, I think, will have an effect that the country probably doesn't wish for. But you're in a spot of having to balance the budget, increase military spending because we need it, and that makes you, with the BC Act numbers, make very tough choices. So I appreciate you trying.
And we didn't touch Social Security, retirement, or Medicare.
Okay, and so that's my question. Let's not fool people. You did a really good job. The Meals on Wheels is not being gutted. The block grant portion is being eliminated, and that's 3% of funding, is what you said?
Maximum 3%.
So please quit saying things that are not true. There's enough we can say about this budget that is true. So the bottom line is, I would like to eliminate the death tax because I just don't like the concept of taxing people's estate when they die, because every time they made a move while they lived, you tax it. I'd rather have the Walton family take the money and give it away rather than the government grabbing it after they die, because I think the chief philanthropists in this country are a lot of the wealthy people you talked about, and they're doing a lot of good things. They may have a Ferrari in the garage, but I can tell you when it comes to conservation and other things, the Walton family are contributing. So it's just a philosophical difference. If it were up to me, we would have no death tax, because we tax you every time you move while you live. So the bottom line, these are just philosophical debates. It's not meanness, it's just, we just disagree. But the one thing I don't want the public to be misled by is that you do nothing in terms of Medicare and Social Security and solvency, which is coming. Is that correct?
It's correct, sir. We don't make any proposed changes to Social Security retirement.
If you
or
were
Medicare.
able to, if you were unleashed by the president, would you not want to get a grand bargain where we clean up the tax code, take away some deductions for the few at the expense of the many, and save Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security, Medicare and Social Security from insolvency, which is coming?
Senator, let me answer it this way. When I sat here 3 months ago, and y'all asked me what I was going to do, because sometimes I would disagree with the president, which I thought was one of the reasons he hired me, was that I would lay out options for him, and I did that. And I went into the office. I think we had 4 hour-long meetings on mandatory programs, and I gave him a list of proposed mandatory changes. And at the end of the last meeting, he went, yes, 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 no, no, no. And the answer for no, no, no were Social Security, retirement, Medicare. Because he said, look, I looked people in the eye when I ran for office. I promised I wouldn't change them. I'm keeping that promise.
But here's what the president needs to do. He needs to look people in the eye and tell him that that's an impossible promise if you're serious about getting out of debt. Now, Mr. President, quit playing the game everybody else plays up here. By 2042, Medicare and Social Security alone will consume all the revenue sent to Washington. That's the projection. Is that correct?
I've seen similar numbers, yes, sir.
Because the baby boomers retire en masse, of which I am one. So you can't skip over Medicare. You can't skip over Social Security if you're serious about preventing us from becoming Greece. And to skip over these programs is to allow them to die over time. So the one thing I would say to my Republican colleagues who believe you don't need entitlement reform, including the president, to keep us from becoming Greece, you're wrong. And Mr. Mulvaney, you know the right solution.
I will deliver that message to the President
Well,
of the
thank you.
United States.
And you have been the solution in my view. Thank you for what you did with the ports, very innovative solution to funding ports. We'll have a disagreement about MOX, but let me tell you one thing about the budget that does bother me. Soft power. Do you agree with me that we're never going to win the war on terror just through dropping bombs on terrorists?
Senator, I agree that's one of the greatest military challenges we face. You know why we did what we did. Again, it was the president keeping his promise to spend less money on foreign aid.
All I can tell you is that I don't know what it cost the country to ignore Afghanistan before 9/11 to the taxpayer. But when you shoot women in soccer stadiums for sport, when you blow up statues of anybody's religion, to expect nothing to come your way is a huge mistake to the American taxpayer. The King of Jordan is the best ally we could hope to have. We reduced his funding by $279 million. I got a call from the ambassador of Jordan saying, what did we do wrong? Nothing, ma'am. Georgia, a frontline state in the crosshairs of Putin, 66% reduction in their assistance. These people are not owed a dime by the American taxpayer. Foreign aid is 1% of the budget, but I will tell you this, Mr. Mulvaney, from my humble point of view, if we don't help the King of Jordan more at a time of critical need, his kingdom could fall. If we don't push back from Russia and help those in the crosshairs of having their democracy destroyed, I don't know what that cost to the taxpayer is, but to me it is an unacceptable cost. So the reason I'd vote no is because soft power is destroyed in this budget.
Thank you, Senator.
Senator Whitehouse.
Thank you very much, Chairman. Mr. Mulvaney, can we talk about the tax cuts, tax reform proposal? You just said that you assume that the tax reform plan is going to be deficit neutral. Is that correct?
Yes, Senator.
And your presentation to this committee states that it is deficit neutral, correct?
Yeah, basically, Senator, we had three choices, which is we could assume the tax plan, which is still in its very early stages, it's not really a plan. would
So there's no scoring on it yet. That's an assumption
either
at this
add to
point.
the deficit, subtract from the deficit, or be deficit neutral, and we picked the third, the middle way.
And the way that you get to that conclusion is that you recognize that there will be immediate revenue reductions from lower tax rates and calculate that they will be offset by increased revenues from enhanced economic activity. And they offset each other to deficit neutrality.
With respect, sir, no, that's not the calculation we went through.
Okay, what was the calculation?
We went through the list of exclusions that are reduced, loopholes that are closed, deductions that are removed. I can't remember what the number that we assigned to the ending. The proposal includes to remove the deduction for state and local taxes, which is a huge number. We get rid of a wide variety of personal deductions, including, I think, everything except, I think the proposal has some mortgage
So
interest
your
we keep in charity.
testimony here is that you are not assuming any growth from tax revenues as a result of increased economic activity in reaching the deficit neutrality. That is all going to be
We do
tax
it-
dollars in, tax dollars out, no added growth as the basis for deficit neutrality.
I don't know if I'm agreeing or disagreeing with you, but let me tell you what we did. We assumed economic growth. Certainly, it's part of the, as I mentioned in my opening statement, the assumptions that how we got to 3% growth, tax policies were part of it. And certainly, when we do go to 3% growth, we assume that government revenues go up. So we assume that there is growth, but we did not use those numbers to say that the tax policy was deficit neutral.
So the tax policy, as you foresee it, will be one that is deficit neutral without regard to growth, without regard to the increased growth that you assign to the tax policy itself. There's a circularity, you know, where people say, well, we're going to change the tax code, and that is going to increase revenues, and then we're going to bake those revenues back into the tax code. That is not going to be a manner in which you achieve deficit neutrality when you get your tax code proposal together.
Again, I think we're agreeing, but just to use my own words, is that I'm aware of the accusations of double counting. I do not believe that we engaged in that.
But the only way that that becomes true is if, in fact, the tax reform proposal is deficit neutral
on its
without
own
regard to growth from the tax proposal.
Exactly, so we are agreeing on that point. And keep in mind, when we have to make these assumptions for the budget, and in fact, we're very early on in the discussion on what a tax policy would look like, we have to make certain assumptions. And the three options that I mentioned to you were the three options we took. I guess we probably could have made the assumption that the tax policy by itself would reduce the deficit. We chose not to do that. My guess is there are some of you who would make the contention that the tax policy by itself should add to the deficit. We chose the middle way to say, look, we don't know enough about the tax policy. We know some of the basic principles of it. We're going to lower rates, we're going to simplify, but we're going to get rid of this whole host of deductions, and so some of which are massive, and said, look, the most defensible, conservative with a small c way to look at this is to say, on its own policies, those will be deficit neutral. Now, whether or not what y'all find what passing and when we negotiate with you on a final tax bill, what it looks like, I can't say, but we have to make certain assumptions early in the process to do the budget.
So when we look at your tax proposal, when it gets to a level of specificity that we can actually look at, we will be looking at growth numbers that are a constant with and without the tax code, and the deficit neutrality will be the function of changes within the tax code itself, not projections of growth.
Let me look at it a different way, and again, see if we're agreeing by using different words. When we offer next year's budget, we won't be able to make those assumptions, I hope, regarding what the tax policy would look like, because we hope that it's either in law or very close to being in law. So we won't be forced with that choice of looking at some piece of paper with basic principles and trying to do the math on that, but we'll have a specific thing that we might be able to score and make more detailed assumptions regarding.
Because you do recognize that if you count the growth here in the budget, and then you count it again in your tax proposal, that is a double count, and you're saying it's not a double count because you are not going to use it twice in that way.
And I wouldn't want to come now and have to answer questions from my good friend Senator Van Hollen if I was actually double counting.
Thank you. My time has expired.
Senator Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let's talk about why you want to grow the economy. If you go from 2% to 3% growth, that's about $14 trillion over 10 years of added economic activity. If you assume revenue of the federal government is about 18% of GDP, that's about $2.5 trillion of additional revenue flowing to the federal government without raising anybody's taxes, correct?
We scored it, I think, at 2.1 trillion, but yes, we're in the same ballpark.
Right, so that's why you want to grow the economy. And I think the whole purpose of tax reform would be to rationalize our tax system so it incentivizes growth. So from my standpoint, when we're trying to score a tax proposal, you actually want to see a static revenue loss made up by economic growth, so you have a dynamic score that comes as close to revenue neutral as possible. I mean, just having a revenue neutral tax reform doesn't do much. It just redistributes income. So, I mean, isn't that what you're trying to do, is you're trying to rationalize the tax system so we gain the type of economic growth that does put more revenue in the federal government?
Again, I think my answer to you, Senator, be the same as I just gave to Senator
Well, I don't care
Whitehouse.
about the double,
Yeah.
that was beyond me.
Okay.
I'm talking about just basic stuff. $14 trillion of economic growth yields more than $2 trillion of revenue. So you want to have a tax policy that makes America more competitive so we can grow our economy.
Look at it another way, Senator. If in a world of 1.9% growth, we will never balance the budget again.
So let's talk, I've got a chart here, my 30-year deficit chart. Here are the stark facts, latest CBO projection, put it into dollars. Over the next 30 years, we have a projected deficit of $129 trillion. That'd be added on to our $20 trillion worth of debt. The net value of all private assets, $128 trillion, clearly unsustainable. But let's go to the next sheet. This is what I call my one-page income statement over 30 years. Three things are yellowed, actually four things, but three things I want to highlight. The deficit in Social Security over the next 30 years is about $18.5 trillion. In other words, we'll pay out $18.5 trillion more in benefits than we bring the payroll tax over the next 30 years. Social Security, $18.5 trillion. Medicare is $39 trillion deficit. The remainder of that $129 trillion basically is $65 trillion interest on the debt. So in other words, if we don't want to pay $65 trillion in interest to our creditors, we better address Social Security and Medicare. And I want to focus on Medicare. I want to talk a little bit about how do you restrain the growth in health care costs? Isn't that what ought to be the primary goal of any health care proposal coming out of Congress? How do we bring competitive, consumer-driven competition to restrain the growth of costs, actually improve quality and access through competition? Can you tell me in the American Health Choice Acts or whatever, the the House bill, what in that bill is going to drive consumer-driven competition to restrain the growth in healthcare costs? Because that's the number one thing we've got to do if we want to not pay $64 trillion to our creditors.
It's a bunch of different things. I'll pick one for sake of the discussion, which is I think Medicaid is one of the larger drivers up here as well. You can see it behind us. Medicaid is a state-administered program. States also pay for it. I remember being in the state legislature, looking at that line item, which I think at that time was the second largest line item in our state budget after K-12 education, and thinking, oh my goodness, look at this number. What do we spend it on? Finding out, and then saying, well, why are we spending it that way when we could spend it another way better, more efficiently? And they said, well, if you want to do it your own way, you can't get the federal match. If you want to actually take care of the people in South Carolina the way you think you should, in a manner that's effective and efficient, delivers that care, because we all want to take care of our most needy, we couldn't do that because the federal government didn't allow us to do that. The AHCA changes that. It's one of the fundamental sort of structural changes that you get with the House version of the bill, which is what we do is we put the states in much more control over how they administer health care at the local level. And that's one of the one of the long-term drivers of cost. You get to the very heart of the matter. How do we make health care more affordable? Just about everything that we buy is more affordable and of higher quality than it was 10 years ago, except healthcare? How do we
In
change
the
that?
40s, 68 cents for every healthcare dollar was actually paid for by the patient. Today, it's about 11 cents. We've driven free market competition out of it. And let me just use HSAs because I know that's something else in the House bill. In my own businesses, healthcare costs were escalating. Congress did pass the HSA law. And so we went from probably about, I can't remember exactly, about a $1,000 deductible plan to, I think at the time it was a $2,500 HSA qualified plan. The premium savings that we realized just by making that small little change, and let's face it, Obamacare policies are far higher deductible than that. Just that switch allowed me to take that premium savings, divvy it up by the employees, and invest $3,000 per year per employee in their HSA accounts. 10 years later, they probably got about $30,000 per employee in HSA. Now they've got that money, that's their money, and they're driving consumer choice in things like walk-in clinics, Walmart, CVS, Walgreens. It actually does work. So you're investing how much in HSAs in the House bill?
Oh, I can't remember what the number is, but I know it's a dramatic expansion of the HSA program. I'm sorry, I don't have the numbers.
Okay, but again, isn't that the direction we need to go? If we want to solve this long-term deficit, so much of government spending is involved in health care. We've got to really focus on restraining the growth in health care costs.
Agreed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Warner.
Good morning, Mr. Mulvaney.
Morning, Senator.
So much to talk about. I got to follow up on a couple of these, though.
Sure.
You assume, I've seen lots of tricky budgets before, but this may take the cake. You assume abolishment of the so-called death tax, estate tax, but when you go to your table S3 baseline by category, you still count the revenues from the estate and gift tax, which is kind of a tricky thing. I would call that double counting. Your outside experts have assumed that your tax plan would cost $5 trillion. As somebody who spent a couple years, as you know, trying to wrestle with these numbers and took on entitlement reform, took on additional revenues, I don't think there's any way you can get there with elimination of tax expenditures, particularly when you take charitable, home mortgage, and retirement accounts off the table. There's just, there aren't enough tax deductions to get to those numbers, unless you're going to, I imagine you're now saying you're going to go ahead and dramatically cut back on the deductibility of employer-provided health care plans. That's a large number.
I'm sorry, sir. Specific question I was making.
The specific question is, you got $5 trillion in cost in your tax plan.
Right.
Unpaid for. You cannot pay for it in any revenue-neutral basis without double or triple counting or dynamic scoring on steroids if you take charitable, home mortgage, and retirement accounts off the table is not being cut.
Right.
You can't get there. The numbers do not add up. And by the way, I don't think you've told the American public yet that to even get close, you're going to have to then take off the deductibility of employer-provided health care plans. So that's on the table?
Here's what's on the table, which is I think the one-page set of principles that we sent
Sir,
up to the Hill.
I've gone
a couple
through
weeks
these.
ago.
I know you have as well.
Right.
I spent years going through these numbers to try to get them to balance. You got to go where the money is if you're talking about any kind of rational revenue-neutral plan. And I don't think you can get there. And I don't think your numbers add up. I think they don't pass the smell test. And I think, frankly, what Senator Whitehouse was pushing at, that you were not double counting, I just don't believe that as well, because you have put dynamic scoring in place. Dynamic scoring assumes with the tax cuts, because you can't say dynamic scoring alone is going to come about without the tax cuts in place. So if you're counting those on the dynamic scoring process, you've got to bake that in, and so it's not truly a revenue-neutral tax plan. And to get $5 trillion in savings when you take charitable, home mortgage, and retirement accounts off the table, the numbers just don't add up. Let me move to another item because my time is about up. You take non-defense discretionary spending down to 3.1% of GDP. I still got another year or two before I can say I spent longer in business than I have in government. I was a venture capitalist. I invested in a lot of businesses. I would invest in businesses based on their investments in their workforce, plant and equipment, and staying ahead of the competition. For an American tax plan and business plan, that would equate to investment in people, which is education. Plant and equipment equals infrastructure. Staying ahead of the competition in a global economy means research and development. How can you cut those so draconianly, cutting discretionary spending by $1.4 trillion over the next 10 years, cut those three areas, and assume that we're going to have all this growth you project? And, you know, I would never invest in a business that spent less than 3% of its revenue line on workforce, plant and equipment, and staying ahead of the competition. And that's what you're saying the American business plan ought to be.
No, I'm not, sir. And I would suggest to you that you would also never invest in a business whose revenues were growing dramatically fast, their expenses were growing dramatically faster than the revenues, which is what we've seen here.
Amen to that. So let's deal with both sides, both the spending
Your
and the
capital
revenues.
investment, I think you're looking at only one part of the equation when you look at the American business plan, because we agree with you that capital investment is absolutely critical. In fact, you cannot get 3% growth without having dramatic increases in capital investment. We just simply think that private capital investment is a more efficient and effective way to get there. In fact, history proves that, than government capital investment. So what we do is, in our tax plan, try to promote the type of capital investment that you are looking for. We're moving it out of government capital investment, which we think is woefully inefficient, and into the private market capital investment.
All
that we
I
think
would
is
say,
what gets us to 3%.
all I say, Mr. Mulvaney, is that, you know, for the most part in our country, education, infrastructure, and core basic research and development still remain a government function. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, sir.
Senator Perdue.
Wow, I wish we had 2 hours. Thank you for being here. And
I'm sort of glad we don't, Senator, but that's okay.
I can understand that. I just want to highlight a couple of things. First of all, thank you guys for addressing the debt. It's the dirtiest four-letter word in our English language today, and it threatens our republic. And you and I have had private conversations about that. In the last 16 years, under one Republican president, one Democratic president, this federal government has grown in constant dollars from $2.4 trillion to $3.9 trillion. And I know it's a philosophical debate up here between parties about big government, but let's just look at results. You talked about results earlier, so I made some notes here. Big government has failed. It's failed in poverty. In 1964 or 5, the Great Society put the war on poverty. We all were all for that. We wanted poverty reduced in America, but the irony is that the poverty rate today is basically the same as it was in the 60s when that great program was put into place. If you think the government does a great job running businesses, how about the U.S. Postal Service, the VA, Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac? And then we get to Social Security and Medicare. I want to come back to that in a minute. They both go to zero. Their trust funds go to zero in 15 short years or less. And we're sitting in the weakest recovery in 70 years. I want to get to the point of this exercise that we're doing today and call out what a travesty it is relative to the bigger issue. In the last 8 years, as a federal government, we borrowed about 35% of what we spend. And right now, in the 16 budget that goes through 2027, it was projected, CBO projected that we'd borrow another 30% per year on average over that period of time. Well, by definition, if discretionary spending is directionally $1 trillion on a $4 trillion budget, we're spending less than 30% on discretionary. The rest of it is mandatory. That means, by definition, if every dollar of revenue, by the way, we collected more tax dollars last year and the year before that too than we ever have in our history. And yet, we still have this growing debt problem. So by definition, every dollar we spend, every dollar we're debating here today is borrowed money, by definition. So I want America to understand what this travesty is all about up here. The travesty is that we're not talking about $4 trillion of expenditures of the federal government. That's what we're going to spend next year. And it'll grow from there. So what I want to get at here is the fact that the budget process itself is absolutely broken. It's only worked 4 times since 1974 in 43 years. And as a matter of fact, we have to appropriate this budget. You talk about authorizing. I mean, we haven't authorized things up here. We have $310 billion, some 250 programs that are not authorized today, to your earlier point. And that's not even being considered today. As a matter of fact, over the last 43 years, we've averaged 2.5 appropriation bills being passed on average during that period of time. We have to pass 12 to fund the federal government. That means that we're headed for a train wreck again this year. We'll go to September 30th. We will not have the government funded. We'll either do a continuing resolution or we'll have to do an omnibus where 6 people get in a room and the rest of us get an up or down vote about how we spend $1 trillion. And even that doesn't address the $3 trillion of mandatory expenditures. Now, I'm not arguing programs, I'm not arguing cuts. We'll do that at a later point in time. But I have to say this, I applaud the administration for at least addressing the issue that we've got to address over the next 5 years or so, and that is the long-term implication of debt. The specific question I have is, would you support a budget process eventually that would include all expenditures of the federal government?
Senator, yes. In fact, I had part of that discussion with Senator Enzi, believe it or not, in the antechamber before we came into this room. I think it's something that we should start discussing.
Well, as we know, to get at debt, we're not going to do it by working on the $1 trillion.
No, you can't. You cannot balance the budget within the non-defense discretionary portion of the budget at all. You simply cannot do it.
Now, let's talk about growth for a second. And thank you for telling the American people that 1.9 is not acceptable. Let's dial into the 1.9. In the last 8 years, true growth here is 0.6%. That's without population growth. 0.6%. That's productivity. That's the way business guys look at it, because I can manipulate population. I can't manipulate productivity growth. Productivity growth is 0.6%. You want to grow 3%, there are two things we've really got to do, in my opinion, just as a business guy. But you've got to work on the workforce. There are plenty of people right now on the margins of our workforce that are not included in this workforce. I understand the low unemployment number, Director, but I'm concerned about the people that are underemployed. I'm concerned about the people who have dropped out of the workforce. I'm concerned about having matching skills with jobs that are available. That's number one. That's the first constraint on getting to 3% growth. Second is capital. You mentioned it earlier, but we've got $6 trillion of capital. And this is a mistake that politicians make. I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman, but this is important. Politicians think that you want to stimulate 3% growth, we need more capital investment from the federal government. That's the last thing we need, frankly. I believe that right now we need to do whatever we can to free up the $6 trillion that are not at work in this economy. $2 trillion on the Russell 1000 balance sheets because of government policy, not just in the last 8 years, possibly over the last 20 years. The second is our banks, small banks and regional banks have about $2 trillion on their balance sheets because we've taken that capital reserve from 3% to 6% to 7.5%, unilaterally, by the way, in the Basel III agreement, where none of the other countries are really doing the same thing. And lastly, the repatriation tax has $2 trillion or more stuffed overseas. So my question finally is, to you quickly, are those things that you're going to focus on, not just in this budget, but over the next few years to try to continue to develop a consistent 3% growth in this economy?
And I think you, Senator, I think you heard that in part of my exchange with Mr. Warner, is that you must have more capital investment to get the productivity
But
up.
is that capital from the federal government more productive or from the private sector?
And that's the point. And what this budget does is try to focus on private capital investment and not public.
Thank you.
Senator Van Hollen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's great to see you, Mr. Director.
Thank you, Mr. Senator. Good to be here.
And you can call this a taxpayer-first budget, but this is only really great for taxpayers who are in the top 1%. They're the only folks that, looking at the numbers in this budget, actually get a tax cut because you've incorporated the House Healthcare, Trump Care healthcare bill into this, which, as we all know, provides millionaires with, on average, a $50,000 a year tax cut. So it's great for folks at the very top. I should also point out, if we're talking about facts, that revenue in the Affordable Care Act came from applying an investment income tax to households over $250,000 and dedicated to the Medicare Trust Fund. So your proposal also takes 3 years off the solvency of the Medicare Trust Fund. You talked a lot about reducing the debt, and I could not agree with you more. We've had this conversation for years. We got to reduce the debt. And you talked a lot about tax breaks, but isn't it a fact that you do not close a single tax break in this budget for the purpose of reducing the debt?
I think I'm going to agree with you with that, Senator. I think what we do is we close the loopholes. We assume, we have to make a bunch of assumptions, as you know, because you've written budgets as well. And so the assumptions are that those deductions, the loopholes, the exemptions go away in order to keep the tax program deficit neutral. Then we take the benefits of the tax program in the growth.
So my point is that we can all talk, and we should talk about the danger of the debt, but you don't take away one special tax break for anybody, hedge fund managers, for the purpose of reducing that debt. And that's a fact, and we've had a lot of conversations over the years. pointing out that the largest annual expenditure is the category of tax expenditures, tax breaks, even larger than Social Security on an annual basis. Isn't that right?
I believe that's close, yeah. I
Okay.
take
And yet you talk about going after all those other categories to reduce the deficit, but you don't go after the category of tax expenditures. Now, you know, we've disagreed on a lot of things.
in fairness,
but
Senator,
if
I-
I know, if I could just, we've
Okay.
disagreed on a lot of things.
I don't
but-
think that's entirely true, but okay.
But you have had a reputation as a straight shooter, okay? You've had that.
I hope to keep that,
And,
Senator
well,
Van Hollen.
well, now you're working for a president who, anyway, I'm not going to get into that at this moment. But Senator Graham pointed out that when you testified here, in your confirmation hearing, you said just what you did now. You don't want to close one tax break for the purpose of reducing the deficit. We have big disagreements on that. The reality is that revenue as a percent of GDP is about 18% today. The last time we balanced our budget, it was about 19, 20% in the early 2000s. But you don't want to go there. And what you've done instead of, you do cut the Social Security disability. I think that's a bad choice. Those are hardworking people. In order to qualify, you have to work a long time, you get disabled. The whole point is to have insurance policy there. You go after that. But you do not do what Senator Graham mentioned, going further into Medicare and Social Security. Now, here's the thing. I think we should go after tax expenditures. But at least you got to be honest. And instead, what you've done is you've made up a number here based on no policies. You guys have assumed 3% growth. It's easy for all of us to say, oh, we wish we had higher growth. I do too. Why don't we wish 4% growth? It's not just the CBO. Mr. Director, I'm looking at something that you just put out that shows all the forecasts that have been put out there recently. You've got the Professional Forecaster Survey, 2.1% long-term growth. You've got the Reserve Bank of Philadelphia, about 1.9%, around where CBO is. You've got the Economist Intelligence Unit, around 2% long-term economic growth. You have a one-page so-called tax plan that's been put out by this administration. You've got no backup in this budget to tell anybody how you expect to get from 1.92% growth to 3% growth. And the only way you balance this budget is on that, what is fraudulent accounting in the absence of a plan that shows you how to get there. It would be $2 trillion short in 10 years if you hadn't made that assumption. Isn't that true? If you hadn't made your assumption about 3% growth, you'd be $2 trillion short after 10 years of a balanced budget.
Well, I'll agree with you, Senator, that the dynamic impact of the 3% growth is $2.1 trillion in additional revenues.
Okay. The dynamic impact.
Yes, sir.
So you just had this long conversation. I think you and Senator Whitehouse were on very different pages. You're talking about what, again, it's a one-pager, $6 trillion tax cut, which under most,
It was only $5
scoring,
trillion.
you're not
It was
going to
only-
get
it was only $5
okay.
trillion
That's
10 minutes
$5 trillion that puts you in the hole, and somehow you're going to have huge growth that's going to sort of recapture that, and you're going to get 3% growth as a result of that, even though you're going to also capture that for the purpose of deficit reduction. Look, it is flim-flam. I understand you're now representing President Trump, who put the parameters that you described on you. But please, as someone who has a reputation as a straight shooter, don't come before this committee and pretend this is in balance. This isn't close to balance. The harm in the near term is real. The balance in the 10 years, you know, is fantasy flim-flam.
Senator, I will deny that I know that. And what I will say to you is that, as I mentioned, I don't remember who it was earlier, that we sat down and came up with impacts of our policies. And that's how we got from 1.9 to 3% growth. Keep in mind, President Obama in his first budget was assuming 4.6% growth. We didn't do that. By the way, he never even balanced while he was still doing that. We think this is extraordinarily defensible.
You know the two major factors in economic growth, and actually you mentioned it, is population and
Productivity.
your immigration plan, your whole administration's position on immigration is to dramatically reduce immigration in this country. So you've sort of taken off the table one of the major factors, and in place of that, you've got like a one-pager tax plan. So anyway,
Thank you, Senator. I look forward to having.
look forward to talking to you.
Senator Kennedy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
And you're next.
Mr. Director, I don't know you well. but I've watched your effort here and that of your staff. And I have to tell you, I find it refreshing. I want to offer you just a couple of points of view, and I want you to interrupt me if you disagree. I want to talk to you just for a second about how your budget impacts the people in America who get up every day and go to work and obey the law and pay their taxes and try to do the right thing by their kids and maybe save a little money for retirement. I guess we could call them the middle class or the working class. We have a lot of them in Louisiana. And for the past, 20, 25 years or so, what many of those people, in fact, most of those people, would tell me about Washington is that they would say our country, I'm paraphrasing, they would say our country was founded by geniuses, but it's being run by a bunch of idiots. How can our leadership on both sides of the aisle expect to borrow $4 billion a day to operate, run up a almost $20 trillion debt, run deficits? When we try that in our family, it doesn't work. And this is what they also tell me. They tell me that they look around and they see too many undeserving people at the top getting bailouts and special treatment. And they see too many undeserving people at the bottom getting handouts. And they're stuck in the middle and they're getting the bill. And they can't pay it anymore because their health insurance has gone up thanks to the Affordable Care Act, and their kids' tuition has gone up, and their taxes have gone up. But I'll tell you what hadn't gone up is their income. And I think that's why this country is so divided. We have two groups of people. We have those Americans who believe in more freedom, and we have those Americans who believe in more free stuff. I'd like you to tell me how your budget impacts the working class of this country that is being hollowed out and is not sharing in the great wealth of this country, economically, socially, culturally, because the people, the undeserving people, not everybody, but the undeserving people at the top and the bottom who have all 4 feet and their snout in the trough.
Senator, I'm going to answer that in a way you probably don't expect, because the easy answer would be to say that 3% growth helps those folks more than they can possibly imagine. And if they're above the age of 30, they might remember what it was like to work in a healthy American economy when wages were ahead of inflation. People were getting better economic opportunities. You could save for your kids' retirement or your kids' education. You could save for your own retirement. But I'm going to answer it a different way, because you asked me a specific question. What is this? How does this budget help those people? I think, Senator, that part of the disconnect that we see in the nation right now is that those folks that you've just described, many of whom also live in South Carolina, pay their taxes and then hear the stories about how that money is wasted, and they wonder why they're paying taxes. And it undermines their faith in the system when they hear that there are 11,000 dead people getting their money to help pay their dead people bills, when there's people in prison getting benefits, when there's folks who are not in this country legally getting benefits. It saddens them and angers them. Some of them react different ways, but they all react negatively towards the institution of America, and it helps contribute to that us and them mentality, and I think that is unhealthy. And what this budget does is looks them in the eye and say, you know what? We're not going to allow that anymore. And if we are wasting your money, we're going to stop. If it's going to somebody who shouldn't get it, we're going to stop. And we're going to respect your money as much as you do. And hopefully, that'll help cure some of the ills that you just mentioned.
I want to thank you, and thank you, Mr. Chairman. I don't agree with everything in your budget, but I sure do thank you and your staff for your approach.
Thank you, Senator.
Senator Murray.
Well, thank you, Chairman NZ. Thank you, Director Mulvaney, for joining us. I got to say, you got a tough job today. I don't envy you. You have been asked to come before this committee to explain the unexplainable, and